Our first presenter for our Transitions, Education, and Employment in ASD will be Dr. Heather Brown. Dr. Brown was originally trained as an elementary school teacher, but she is now an assistant professor at the University of Alberta. Dr. Brown's research program investigates the academic achievement of students with autism spectrum disorder, and Dr. Brown also has Asperger's syndrome. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brown.
So hi, I was asked to speak to you today a bit about my story, specifically as it relates to employment. So that's me as a little girl. Back then I didn't know I had Asperger's syndrome, but I certainly knew that something was wrong with me. I spent a lot of time fighting with my mom and my brother. I didn't have any friends. I certainly didn't eat. I was picky beyond all belief, I still am. And I was obsessed with doing well at school. So needless to say, I struggled much of my life. But I am nevertheless standing here before you as a tenure-track professor at the University of Alberta, where I study the academic skills of kids with ASD. In other words, I have a full-time job that I love that is in line with my skills and abilities. So despite the struggles we face, I truly believe that everyone on the autism spectrum can find a place where they belong. Let's look at some of these adults with ASD who are employed. Where are they working? So in one study by Roux et al. In 2013, they looked at young adults with ASD, some of whom also had an intellectual disability. They were 21 to 25 years of age, and they had 452 employed adults with ASD in their sample. So where did they work? Well, they worked in office and administration support, transportation and materials moving, production work, including assembly line work, food preparation and serving, and maintenance, such as building maintenance and grounds clearing. In a second study by Autism et al. In 2017, they looked at the top 6 fields listed by employed adults with Asperger's disorder. In their study, their participants were 18 years and older, but the mean age of their sample was 38 years. And they had 154 employed adults with AD in their sample. So what were the top 6 fields? Well, information technology, which isn't much of a surprise, I guess, education and teaching, retail, healthcare, restaurant and food services, and government. But what about me? Where have I worked? Well, I've worked at a lot of jobs because I hated most of them, which either got me fired or I quit. So, specifically, I've worked in education and teaching. I've been an elementary school teacher, a tutor, a professor, and a grad student. I've worked in retail. I had my first job at Jumbo Video, and I've also worked at Northern Reflections. I've worked in healthcare. I worked in a medical lab doing data entry. I worked as a veterinary technician and even a personal support worker. And I even worked in restaurant and food services, where I worked at Subway. This is one of the funniest stories because while I did get fired, I got fired because I was apparently unable to properly cut open the bun. Who knew? So one of the biggest job categories that's missing from this list for me is data entry, which I absolutely despise, which I guess would maybe fall under accounting. I hate data entry, but I have had, unfortunately, a lot of data entry jobs. So many people with ASD have difficulties getting a job, and I was no exception. First, I had absolutely no idea what job I wanted. For anyone struggling with this issue, I would definitely recommend volunteering. I spent a great number of years volunteering in as many different jobs as a young adult, and it helped me figure out what I liked and what I didn't. And it helped me gain, even more importantly, important job skills. People in charge are much more gentle and forgiving of people who are volunteers than people who are employees. So after trying many different jobs, I finally decided that I wanted to be an elementary school teacher. So I applied to complete my Bachelor of Education. I honestly feel that education and training is a really important part of the work finding process. But during and after my degree, I still volunteered. Like many people with ASD, I needed more hands-on experience and training of how to do my job. In this case, how to be a teacher in the classroom. Plus, by volunteering at many different schools, I made sure that principals and teachers knew who I was. I also got professional help to write my resume and cover letters. I actually paid to have my resume written. But I also read lots of books on the topic, and I would talk to those different employment support people too. My resume and cover letters seemed to have worked because I ended up getting lots of interviews for jobs. But I kept failing the interview over and over again. Actually, I failed more than 30 job interviews for elementary teaching positions, which is definitely not my most shining moment. But what I learned in those 30 job interviews was that principals ask variations of 6 questions in every interview. So I asked the principals at the schools where I volunteered what the correct answers to those 6 questions were. Then I memorized the answers, and I practiced giving those answers over and over again. And lo and behold, I was finally offered my first teaching job. This is my very first staff picture. I was finally employed. But of course, getting the job is only the first step. Once you're employed, individuals with ASD tend to struggle with a host of difficulties. So according to a review by Hayward in 2016, we have difficulties with sensory sensitivities, getting along with others, planning, organization, and focus, job dissatisfaction, and stress. So I myself have had problems with basically all of those. I am very sensitive to sensory input, especially sights, sounds, smells, and boredom. One of my own personal versions of hell was working for a gas company in their accounting department, doing, of course, data entry. So I was asked to work in a huge room with 60 other people. Everyone got to sit in 4 pod cubicles, kind of like this. And I got to sit in that cubicle all day, every day, and enter numbers into a computer. Not only was I bored out of my mind, but I was overwhelmed by sensation too. The noise was a huge problem. In other jobs, I dealt with both the noise and the boredom by listening to audiobooks or even just music on my Walkman. But this strategy was denied to me as a Walkman was against company policy because, I was told, I might not be able to hear my phone ring. Seriously? But needless to say, I was miserable and I quit this job after a few months. If I'd had this job today, I would have had a few more strategies in my toolbox to help me cope. One of my favorite strategies is my musician's ears, which are really just fancy earplugs and they have greatly improved the quality of my life. They take every noise in my environment and they make it 15 or 25 decibels quieter. It was really hard for me to learn to tolerate the earplugs at first because I couldn't stand the sensation of them being in my ears. But as my tolerance for them grew, I could wear the plugs longer and longer each day. Within a year, I could wear them all day. Earplugs give me some control over sound in my environment, and they help me to better tolerate unpleasant noise. Today, I don't need to wear them all day, but I always keep them in my purse. If my environment gets too loud, I can just pop them in. You can get musician's ears from any audiologist. A second strategy is physical exertion. So when I'm given a break, I often do physical work to sort of help balance myself. I was once in a training session at a huge hotel where I was expected to sit still and listen for 6 hours a day for 5 days in a row. They gave us 15-minute breaks through the morning and the afternoon sessions. In my break, while everyone else was socializing, I would walk up as many stairs in that hotel room, as many flights of stairs in that hotel room, as I could possibly walk until I was exhausted, and then I would walk back down. This would help ease that feeling of having ants in my pants and would allow me to settle and listen to the remaining half of each lecture. So any form of physical exertion that sort of gets my heart rate up for even 5 or 10 minutes helps me reduce the amount of stress and adrenaline in my body so that I'm better able to sit still, focus, and cope. So researchers have also examined what predicts whether or not an individual with ASD is employed. However, in this particular study, it wasn't completely clear whether they meant predictors of becoming employed or staying employed. But nevertheless, this is what they found. And the first one really surprised me. Adults with ASD were 3 times more likely to be employed if they disclosed their ASD disability to their employer. Adults with ASD also had greater odds of employment if they achieved higher levels of education, and individuals with more family support were also more likely to be employed. So you might be wondering how, if I started as an elementary school teacher, I ended up working as a professor in special education. Well, it has a lot to do with fit. When I was working as an elementary school teacher, I met a boy in my grade 2 class who had Asperger's syndrome. At the time, I'd never heard of it. I had no idea what it was. But as I learned about the boy and his symptoms, I began to wonder if maybe in grade 2, I would have looked and behaved much like he was behaving now. To make a very long story short, at the age of 30, I received the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome from a registered psychologist who specialized in helping individuals with ASD. But let's go back to my story. So while I was succeeding in general as an elementary school teacher, especially when I was working with the kids, the job was not the best fit. There are still a lot of social rules that I just didn't understand. And I came into conflict with some of my other teachers too. Not understanding social rules is extraordinarily scary because you're moving along through life thinking that everything is just fine when all of a sudden things blow up in your face and you never expected it. I can't even begin to count the number of times I've offended someone, especially a colleague, without ever intending to. And because it was not my intention to be rude or what have you, suddenly facing an unexpectedly irate colleague can be quite anxiety-provoking. I decided to go back to graduate school because I thought the people there might be a bit more like me. People who worked hard at school, were detail-oriented, and all had intense special interests. So professors certainly tend to fit that sort of typical autistic stereotype. It was a super hard decision too, though, because I was finally relatively successfully employed. And here I was about to throw it all away and then start all over again. But I'm really glad I did, because I made and kept friends for the very first time in my life while I was in graduate school. I started to experience real job success too. For the first, I was good at research, I was good at applying for awards and writing papers, and for the first time in my life, I began to start to actually like who I was. And then, despite the incredible competition, and thanks to hard work, luck, and really good fit, I am finally happily employed. I think that finding a place where you belong in the world is one of the most important jobs of our lives. And I think that helping individuals with ASD find some meaning and purpose for their life, a way to connect to society and be successful, however that might look for them, is what so many of us desperately need. In my research, I examined the academic skills of kids with ASD because succeeding academically, going on to post-secondary education, and ultimately specializing in a field is what the pathway that worked for me. And I want to explore if this pathway can work for others too. But regardless of the pathway that the person with autism will ultimately take, the most important thing is to keep trying, to keep looking, until you finally find the path that fits best for you. Thank you.